History is all around us. There are secrets of our past around every corner, hidden in our streets, buried under our feet. And in this series, I'm going to uncover those secrets by looking at Britain's most historic towns.
You're in my way! Get out of the way!
I want to find out which towns across the UK can reveal the most about each period in British history. I think he's quite good, actually. I like a bit of anatomy in a statue. I'll be deciphering clues in familiar landscapes, bringing lost landmarks back to life, and turning back the clock to reveal how these towns looked at key stages in their history.
You shouldn't be in here, should you?
From the Stuarts to the Edwardians, the Civil War to the Second World War, I'll reveal the story of an era through the story of a single town. Today, I'm in Britain's most Plantagenet town. A town where a brutal murder became a reason for celebration.
It was the biggest party in its entire history.
A town where lethal disease and violent uprisings shook the foundations of civilization.
You could wipe out most of a generation.
And a town so iconic it inspired an author to pioneer the English we speak today.
Longenfuk to Goon on pilgrimages.
That's fantastic. If you want to understand the Plantagenets, Canterbury is the place to come. Canterbury is a small cathedral city that holds big appeal for visitors. Its population of 55,000 somehow makes room for the 7 million tourists who flock here each year. They're in Canterbury to soak up some of England's most compelling history. Stashed inside these wonderful old walls are stories of drama, intrigue and rebellion that will make your spine tingle. And of course, centre stage, there's that cathedral, a towering theatre of dreams and nightmares. Every era in Canterbury's past is fascinating, but I'm here to understand one of the most dramatic chapters in British history, the story of the Plantagenet dynasty. Towards the end of the Middle Ages or medieval period, between 1154 and 1399, 8 kings with French blood ruled England and half of France. This was a time when the Catholic Church in Rome dominated every aspect of people's lives here in England. When powerful kings led crusades to conquer the Holy Lands of the Middle East. And above all, a time when different powers were battling for supremacy, as barons tried to control kings and the crown tried to overtake the influence of the church. Canterbury would play a key role in the Plantagenet era, but to understand why, we need to wind the clock back a few centuries more. It was our old friends the Romans who first established Canterbury as an inland river port, nicely sheltered from the Thames estuary, strategically located on the road from the port of Dover to London. In 597, the Pope sent his missionary Augustine to convert the pagan King of Kent, Ethelbert, to Christianity. Well, Augustine must have made quite an impression because the king gave the monks this land on which to build the abbey that once stood here. Soon after, Augustine was installed as the first Archbishop of Canterbury in a new cathedral in the bustling town centre. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they completely rebuilt the cathedral, and it became the ultimate symbol of religious power in England. There followed centuries of almost non-stop embellishment and renovation, transforming its size and appearance, resulting in today's iconic Christian monument. it's 1154. Canterbury is established as the centre of Christianity in England, and Henry II is on the throne. The Plantagenet era has begun. But what sort of a country were the Plantagenets inheriting? The population of England was still under 3 million, but growing fast. It was a time when regional capitals like Canterbury played a key role in society. This is such a colourful period in our history. Dr. Sheila Sweetenberg lectures in medieval studies at the University of Kent. Sheila, what was life like in Canterbury in the middle of the 12th century?
I think it would have been really good for the people who lived here. You've got silversmiths, goldsmiths, you've got tanners, you've got bakers, you've got markets around in the city. And in terms of your streets, all right, they're not going to be paved like this, but you're looking probably at rammed flint and that sort of thing. So you've got quite a hard surface. This is not a place of just muck and mud. The Middle Ages isn't like that. They may not understand hygiene as we do today, but they understood that bad smells could bring disease.
Who was really in charge, Crown or Church?
In Canterbury, the king would have thought he was in charge, but probably it was the Church. Most of the time there's disputes going on between the two of them, so it's very fluid from that perspective.
Why do we call this the Plantagenet dynasty?
Well, it comes from Henry II's father. It's his nickname. It's probably relating to the fact that he put a sprig of broom in his helmet. So it comes from the Latin for broom, Plantagenistus, and they become the Plantagenets. Absolutely.
I can't wait to get my teeth into this Plantagenet period.
Absolutely. So many of the big personalities of that 250-year period were either from Canterbury, came to Canterbury, or died in Canterbury.
Canterbury had a key role in the Plantagenet drama, thanks to its supreme religious status. Evidence of this ecclesiastical power is everywhere you look. But it's even clearer from the sky, as Ben Robinson is finding out.
I get a great sense of the topography of the town, of the layout of Canterbury. First thing you notice, how much land is being taken up by the religious institutions. The cathedral precincts look like a sort of town within a town, an enclave preserved from the rest of the town. So there's all manner of religious buildings in there. I can see it's a leafy green area, but walled. There's a circuit of defences around it almost. And it's sort of mirroring how the church is a state within a state, if you like. So you can really get a sense of who's in charge here, who's important, who's dominating the place.
It was the power of the church that led to the pivotal moment of the Plantagenet era, and it happened right here in the cathedral in 1170. Henry II hated the fact that the church played by its own rules and that he had no say in its affairs. So then he has what seems like a brilliant idea, and he decides to make a key tactical appointment. He makes his friend and loyal advisor, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. So this man, who was not a man of the cloth, who was ordained the night before he became Archbishop, ascended to this position of power within the church. Henry had his man on the inside, or so he thought. What Henry hadn't planned on was that Becket would find God in a big way. This born-again Archbishop proved to be an even greater thorn in Henry's side than his predecessors. After one particularly furious disagreement, Henry had had enough.
He got so furious that he said something along the lines of, "I took this low-born man and rose him high, and he has shamed me, he has shamed the realm. Is there no one who will revenge me?"
Medieval historian Rachel Koopmans has studied Becket's final moments. So the knights come here to confront him?
Actually, they first confront him in the Archbishop's palace.
Yeah.
And then at that point, the monks and his clerics get frightened for him and are dragging him down this cloister.
Yeah.
And they finally get him here and they take him through this door.
At which point he should have been safe.
You would think, yes. And now they entered into the space of the cathedral.
So they chase him in?
They chase him in. He comes back towards them and says, "Here I am, no traitor, but an archbishop. What do you want from me?" Perhaps they wanted just to arrest him, but he struggled against them, and pretty soon the blows started to fall. And the one wound that all the chroniclers talk about is that they actually chopped the top of his skull right off. You have to imagine the power of those broadswords. And as he was lying then here dead, one of the knights actually took the tip of his sword and pulled his brains out onto the floor.
It's horrendous, it's terrifying. It's an act of terrorism happening inside the church.
That's right, and you know, if he had been murdered just outside of those doors, it probably wouldn't have had the same emotional resonance. So, you know, the fact that he was killed here inside the church really was incredibly important for kind of the mythology of him as a martyr.
Henry was free of the troublesome priest, but before long the Pope made Becket a saint. Tales of miracles bestowed on those who touched St. Thomas's mortal remains drew thousands of pilgrims to Canterbury, adding to the power of the church. And soon enough, Henry would need a miracle of his own. 3 years after Becket's murder, he was at war with Scottish rebels and his own sons. A desperate Henry entered the cathedral barefoot, in sackcloth.
He goes down into the crypt to where Becket is buried, and there he spends the whole night in prayer and in penitence. He finds out a few days later that it was that very morning that he finished that penance, that the King of Scotland was captured. Everybody thought that the fact that this rebellion evaporated after he was here on penance meant that Becket was now his friend again.
So Henry had his miracle, but the story of St. Thomas and his influence on Canterbury and the lives of ordinary Britons had only just begun. Next, I visit the venue of the biggest party Canterbury had ever seen and reveal an illuminating new discovery. Oh, that sent shivers down my spine. Yeah. That's amazing. I'm in Canterbury, a tourist mecca and stunning showcase of over 1,000 years of English history. But it's the Plantagenets who ruled England from the 12th to the 14th centuries that I want to uncover. The first Plantagenet king, Henry II, had battled to keep control of great chunks of land in France, Ireland and Scotland, but he couldn't win the war with his sons, and he finally died in 1189, a betrayed and broken father. Henry was succeeded by his son, Richard the Lionheart, who was famous for fighting a successful crusade against the Islamic Sultan Saladin in the Holy Land. Richard was admired, but it has to be said, largely absent. And just 10 years into his reign, he died, and his brother John came to the throne. And John was trouble. Unlucky in war, John soon lost most of his French territory, then mercilessly taxed his English barons, who were his crucial and powerful deputies in governing the land. Then he fell out with the Pope over who got to choose the Archbishop of Canterbury. Finally, with few friends left, King John realised he'd better make amends with the church and issued a charter to try to patch things up. I'm in the cathedral library and the head of the archives, Cressida Williams, is going to show me this incredibly important document. This wonderful moment, getting things out of the archives. And what an amazing seal.
Yes, so we have here an image of King John sitting on his throne in majesty. And there are no contemporary depictions of King John, so this is really as close as we get.
It's very, very beautiful, this seal, but I'm desperate to actually look at the charter itself. So can we get it out?
Of course, let's get it out.
It's incredible just how legible it actually is, isn't it? I mean, it's so clear. Can you pick some key parts out for me?
Yes, so with this charter, John is granting to the church the right of free election of its senior members. So he notes that he's had discussions with senior churchmen, and of course the first named is Stephen, Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is a very significant moment.
So this is Stephen Langton, who was in exile for years, and he's now back.
Absolutely, yes.
Now he's in this position of supreme political power.
Yes, in obviously extremely challenging times. He becomes a negotiator between King John and the barons.
Archbishop Langton was a key architect of another, much more famous charter, now seen as a cornerstone of democratic constitutions, Magna Carta. Canterbury's original 1215 copy is damaged and mostly unreadable. But Cressida has a version made only slightly later. So this is setting out all of these rights for the barons, but also for common people as well?
Yes, very, very important clause can be found just at the top of this folio here. This relates to the principle of trial by jury. So, nullus liber homo capiata, no free man should be captured except by the judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. So this is the start, the seed, if you like, of a very, very important element in our democracy, the principle that one is tried by one's peers.
So it's not just the King's Manifesto, it's more, this is what happens in Britain. King John died soon after sealing Magna Carta, but Archbishop Langton had only just got started. Newly empowered, he could devote his energy to reinvigorating the rather tired cathedral buildings and the image of the church. And when he arrived here in Canterbury, he needed a palace, not just somewhere to live, but somewhere to wine and dine people, to hold great parties, to create alliances. Langton created a building that has all but disappeared, unless you look very closely. This is what I really love, this detective work, looking for traces of the past in existing buildings. If you look just there, you can see the stone tracery of a window, the quatrefoil at the top, and then over here, this is the great porch, the entrance into this incredibly ostentatious symbol of religious power. Stretching 50 metres in length and with a roof spanning 20 metres, the great Archbishop's Palace Hall boasted 8 huge bay windows, a large kitchen, new stables, and a whole array of service buildings. And next door, the cathedral itself had not been neglected. The original Norman building was extended. By 1220, it had doubled in length and had new chapels and towers. And at the far east end was the new centrepiece of Langton's PR Drive. The Trinity Chapel was to be Thomas Becket's new home and would make a big impression. Inside, Langton pulled out all the stops. Light streamed through new stained glass windows onto huge marble pillars, striped in red for Becket's blood, white for his brains. Finally, 50 years after his murder, St Thomas's remains were moved up from the basement crypt to a glorious new shrine. This was the translation. The shrine itself was completely destroyed during Henry VIII's Reformation, but I've caught up again with Rachel Koopmans, who studied this space. This is the very spot where St Thomas's shrine stood.
That's right. So where you can see this jagged edge, that jagged edge shows us where the shrine base was.
It was huge.
It is enormous. Yeah.
And what would it have been like?
Well, it would have had 3 steps On top of that, there would have been a stone base, and then on top of that would have been the shrine, completely coated in gold. And then on top of that, it was so covered with gems that people said you couldn't even see the gold.
And does this actually contain the mortal remains of Thomas, then?
It does. And that's what gave this space so much kind of energy, because you've got the actual saint relics right here. The saint that people believed did miracles and was this fantastic martyr.
And there was a launch party?
Absolutely. Henry III was here. All the important barons were here. The bishops were here. People came from across Europe. It was the biggest party that Canterbury has ever seen in its entire history. And we even have some of the surviving stained glass, dating from the early 13th century.
Really?
That is the same stained glass that Henry III and Stephen Langton and all the pilgrims who came here on that day of the translation would have seen. It's still here.
Astonishing, isn't it?
It is.
Wonderful. Over the centuries, many of the glass panels have needed extensive repairs and, in some cases, replacement. One of the replacement panels has recently been removed, and it contained an astonishing secret. That's amazing. Hello.
Hello. Hello, Leonie.
Leonie Seliger is director of the Cathedral Studios. What are we looking at here, then?
This panel was supposed to have been made in the 19th century, using some old pieces of glass cobbled together with some new pieces.
So it's a Victorian replica of medieval stained glass?
Is it? That's really why we took that glass out, to investigate. Rachel found something that suddenly made us think, hang on, that's not quite right.
What I found was a woman who had written the first guidebook of Canterbury's glass actually wrote old on her schematic of these panels, and I thought, hey, wait a minute, she wrote this at exactly the time they're supposed to be new.
So when was this written then?
This would have been in the 1890s.
Right, okay.
So that got me thinking, and so I went back to a photograph. This is actually among our earliest photographs of the cathedral, and in this photograph, it actually shows these panels in the window, and this photograph dates to 1861. So that's decades before this glass was supposedly made. And so I brought this evidence then to Leonie and said, I think we need to have a closer look at these panels.
Yeah. That sent shivers down my spine.
Yes.
That's amazing. What fantastic sleuthing.
We decided we have to have the glass on the light box, we have to be able to get microscopes on it, and that's what we did.
And then we were looking down, and we were looking at this.
I can see some lines and
That's right.
perhaps even letters.
Yes, you're right, they are letters. In raking light, it becomes easier to see the outlines.
Is that an R?
Yeah.
And then that looks like an I, and then what's that? An N? An N.
Correct, it's an N. Yep.
Peregrini.
Yes.
Yes. So the Latin, Peregrini Sancti, Pilgrims of the Saint.
That's amazing.
So they told us what we're looking at here.
Do you have an idea of the date precisely?
We do, because of the style of it. The part of the cathedral where this window is found was built between 1182 and 1184. We think it was installed quite shortly thereafterwards. So it's within 15 to 20 years of the martyrdom.
Yeah.
And when this was made, Henry II himself was probably still alive.
Is this one of the earliest representations that we've got of pilgrims coming to Canterbury?
It is without doubt the earliest.
Oh, that's fantastic. So do you know what this would have looked like then, with those letters in place?
Pretty much, yes. With a bit of clever photoshopping, you end up with something that is so pin-sharp and elegant.
It almost looks too perfect, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, but that's what it would have looked like.
But that's really why people came to Canterbury, to experience this perfection of God's house. This was their version of going to a theme park. You know, have this amazing experience of seeing colours and shapes that they would never ever have come across in their daily lives. They literally thought that as light passes through the windows, it became enriched with the stories that were depicted in the glass. And that enriched light would then enter through the eyes into the soul and make you better.
That's amazing, isn't it? That faith in the healing power of St. Thomas was soon to be tested more than anyone could have imagined. In the middle of the 14th century, a wave of pestilence broke upon these shores, and it would cut down nearly half of the British population. I'm going to find out more about this devastating, shape-shifting disease, which was, of course, the Black Death. And I'll learn how ordinary pilgrims played an unwitting role in spreading the plague. I'm in Canterbury, the best place in the country to really find out about life during the 245-year-long span of the Plantagenet dynasty. Since 1154, this small city had seen brutal murder, miracles, palaces, and the party of the century. But by the early 13th century, the Plantagenets had lost most of their French territory. Inheriting a smaller kingdom, Henry III, his son Edward, and his grandson Edward II were principally kings of England. For ordinary people, life in the Middle Ages was nasty, brutish, and short. You were lucky if you made it through childhood, and you were even luckier if you made it beyond 40 or 50. There really was nothing in the way of modern medicine. And so it's not surprising that so many people turn to miracles. And this, of course, is where our old friend Thomas Becket comes back into the story. St. Thomas may have been dead for more than a century, but his fame had only spread, and pilgrims would travel extraordinary distances to visit his shrine. I'm meeting Michael, who is a modern-day pilgrim, and when he goes on his long, slow journeys on foot, he likes to wear medieval garb. So, no, I thought it was rude not to join him.
Oh, good day.
Good day. Oh, I needed a rest after that long journey I've been on from just up the hill. So what were people coming to Canterbury for? I mean, presumably principally to visit Thomas's shrine.
Yes, and when he was murdered, the monks grabbed cloths and went out and dabbled up all the blood and threw it into vats of water, which would be sold as holy water for the next several hundred years, and it would be kept.
It must have been extraordinarily diluted by then. It's like kind of saint homeopathy, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a genuine one.
Is it really? So that's what, a little pouch?
It's a lead ampulla, and this is a modern replica.
So that's a little replica of what that is.
Either drink it yourself or give it to a loved one who's ill. Or in some cases, they've seemed to suggest people threw them on the fields for fertility.
So was there anything else that you might bring back with you then as a souvenir?
Some of them are much more dubious. Canterbury genuinely claimed to have some clay left over from when God made Adam.
That's fantastic.
A tooth of Goliath.
It's an animal tooth, but never mind.
And a piece of snake skin from the Serpent of Eden.
I mean, there is no division here between religion and superstition and just, I mean, sheer madness.
Yeah.
Now, look, who went on these pilgrimages? What sort of people?
Just about everybody, really. People come from all over the known world at the time, really, well, Christendom. You might have a particular devotion to a particular saint. You might be ill in need of a cure.
Yeah.
You might have a friend that needs a cure. There are professional pilgrims that you could pay somebody else to do the pilgrimage for you.
Yeah.
Rather than having to go to all that trouble.
You must have attracted a fair amount of interest as you walked along dressed like this.
Yeah. I think we entertain people as well on the way. The instruments come in handy.
And you've got some instruments here.
Yes.
Can I have a go?
Yeah. Well, I've got a bagpipe you could try. The miller in the Canterbury Tales plays a bagpipe.
Yeah, OK. Just stick that under my arm. OK.
Blow the bag. You won't earn much paying for your supper tonight.
I might leave playing the bagpipes to you, Michael. They're still making a noise. Oh, dear. Real medieval pilgrims travelled to the shrines of saints from across Britain and Europe. These journeys could take weeks, months, even years. When pilgrims finally arrived in Canterbury tired and hungry, they'd need to find an inn for the night, or if they were down on their luck, they could always see if there was room at one of the hostels like this one, Eastbridge Hospital.
Hello.
Brother Kevin is the current master of the Eastbridge Hospital.
And this is where you would come after your cold, damp night downstairs, and you would have your meals here.
Look at that fresco. Is that medieval?
Yeah, that goes back to the 13th century, and it's Christ giving a blessing.
What have we got here? We've got all the masters of the Hospital of St Thomas the Martyr going all the way back.
Yeah, that's the masters back from 1198 through to today with my name there, which I'm quite proud of.
What's interesting, though, is this period in the middle of the 14th century. So we've got a really rapid turnover of masters there. 1349 through to 1351. So we've got Matthew Ashton, William of Fareham, William of Bradell, and he's succeeded by Thomas New, and that's all in the space of 3 years.
Yeah. Well, that was a time of the plague, and it is thought that they died during that epidemic.
And I imagine many of the pilgrims who passed through here as well.
Yes, a very difficult time.
It's very likely that those 3 masters of Eastbridge had succumbed to lethal infection, the disease that became known as the Black Death. From 1347, this plague marched ruthlessly across Western Europe, spreading fast and wide, carried by fleas on rats that thrived on board trade ships. In 1348, it arrived on the south coast of Britain and worked its way relentlessly across the country, decimating the population, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Right, so this is the Undercroft. I've invited Dr. Tim Brooks, an expert in rare and imported pathogens, to Eastbridge's crypt, which was used as a dormitory by pilgrims. So, Tim, down in the vaults here, this is where the pilgrims slept, and I imagine some of them at least must have turned up here with the plague.
Absolutely. There might be somebody there who'd got fleas with them. Then you're likely to get bubonic plague. That's not in itself particularly infectious from person to person. But a small number of people who get it will get a pneumonia before they die. And when they do that, as they're dying, they start coughing up plague in their sputum, in their phlegm. And that is what people can then pick up if they're within, say, 3 feet, and they will then get pneumonic plague. And so somebody who's come into this Undercroft and looked after a patient who coughed on them can walk out of here perfectly healthy, but 2 to 3 days later they'll start coughing, and that's on the next person in a different house. You could wipe out most of a generation.
Yeah, I mean, it is apocalyptic. I think it's really difficult to get your head around just what that impact was when you think of half of the or a third to half of the population being wiped out.
And in a way that you can't understand, you can't control, and so various superstitions about how to protect yourself would gradually arise. Most of them not very useful.
So that leads me nicely on to some of the remedies as well. I mean, they were just taking stabs in the dark to try and work out what to do. Bloodletting, so bleeding patients.
That makes the doctor feel good, but it's not at all good for the patient. In fact, it makes the patient weaker.
Putting plasters of human excrement on the boils.
Putting hot plasters tends to make the boils burst, but I'd rather it wasn't human excrement. Bread would be the better choice.
A gold ring containing dragonwort with an amethyst engraved with a man holding a serpent.
A very good waste of gold.
Drinking gold's another one.
Much bigger waste of gold.
Chicken broth.
That's the one I want.
Yeah?
Oh, yes. Food, water is one of your best ways of surviving a serious illness if you can get it down and keep it down.
And another popular potential cure was lancing the boils. Would that have worked?
Now, that would be probably about your best choice. because if you can get the pus to pour out, then that quite often relieves the focus of infection and increases your survival chances.
There are some potential ideas here. The chicken broth, lancing any boils you might have, and then popping over to get a miracle from St Thomas.
A little bit of faith helps a big deal as well, makes you feel better.
Thank God for the era of antibiotics, is all I can say.
Yes, exactly.
The Black Death, Yersinia pestis, wiped out as much as half of Europe's population in just 5 years. In England, it would take 3 centuries for numbers to fully recover. And remarkably, the effects of the plague are still evident in our landscape today, as Ben can see from the air.
If ever I see a lone church, a church just sitting there in fields on its own, I get suspicious. Churches don't wander off in a huff across the fields away from settlements. They're built to serve communities. And if you've got a church, you had a community. And I'm looking at one down here now. That little community, that little hamlet, village, whatever it was, entirely gone. It's vanished. And this is one of the consequences of the plague. They couldn't farm the land, the village couldn't function, the survivors moved somewhere else. And this is a pattern we see throughout the English countryside.
Eventually, the Black Death died down, but the effects of its devastation rumbled on. And I'm going to find out how it prepared the ground for a huge popular revolt, with rebels converging on cities like Canterbury. During the Plantagenet Era in Canterbury, a series of catastrophic events steered the course of English history. An assassination led to a cult of pilgrimage and worship. A king's unpopularity led to a key step towards democracy. And a diabolical disease decimated and reshaped society. When the country emerged from the horror of the Black Death, it was in terrible shape. There was a critical labour shortage. Fields were left unploughed, untended. And in 1377, a new king, Richard II, came to the throne. He was only 10 years old, too young to rule. And so the reins of power passed into the hands of his greedy uncle. He led a ruling council that soon saw the country at war once again with Scotland and France, raising punishing taxes, including the hated poll tax. The church this time was conspiring with the crown. By 1381, the country was ripe for revolution. So this is Canterbury Castle, or at least the remains of it. But the revolt did come here.
Yes.
I've come to the castle to meet Juliet Barker, a historical writer who has studied what happened next. So I think I would have referred to this as the Peasants' Revolt, and that's my school history coming back to haunt me, but you didn't call it that.
I prefer to call it the Great Revolt because most of the people who actually organised it were what we would now call middle-class people.
See, that's really interesting, because I don't tend to think of the middle classes even existing at this point.
No, and the really fascinating thing is that they're really coming into their own at this period, because what had happened was that the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century had virtually wiped out a huge section of the population. And all the great landlords had lost a huge number of the people who tilled their land.
Yeah.
So the people that were left, they were allowed to buy land. They started to acquire money that they could then trade in the markets. And that's how the whole sort of middle class begins to emerge.
What then makes them disgruntled?
What really triggers it is the heavy amount of taxation. The French had invaded and were burning the towns on the south coast of England. They can see these huge taxes being levied and no successful defence of the realm. The feeling was the government has got to protect us, they've got to look after us. The tension is all there. It just needs a spark to set it off.
And And what about here at Canterbury? What happened here?
The rebels came to the castle, which is the seat of royal government for the whole of Kent. They come in and they grab the sheriff and force him to hand over all his records of royal government, including the poll tax returns, because they see the documentation as being the means of oppressing them.
Yeah, that's where the power lies.
That's where the power lies. So they burn all the poll tax records so that nobody knows who they are, how much they're owed.
So it's an extraordinary mutiny of ordinary people against the authorities.
It's the first great popular revolt, and there are leaders in each of all the areas right across the country, all the way from Somerset down in the south up to North Yorkshire.
But it wasn't just an attack on the records, there was proper violence playing out.
There was proper violence in London itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Treasurer both are pulled out of the Tower of London by the mob and executed on Tower Hill. And they literally chop off their heads and they are displayed on a pike on Tower Bridge, like they did for all traitors.
Things were a little harsher in the medieval period. Remarkably, the 14-year-old King Richard persuaded the rebels to lay down their arms. Then thousands of executions followed, and the revolt was crushed. However, another, much more peaceful cultural revolution was gathering pace. The English language was about to take over. In Plantagenet England, history and law were written in Latin. Poets and nobles at the royal court spoke French. The common language was Middle English, but it was rarely written down. One story did more than any other to change that. Befill Latin that season on a day in Southwark at the Tabard as I lay, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage. In 1387, a poet was inspired to start writing about a group of pilgrims making their way from London to Canterbury. It was, of course, Geoffrey Chaucer with his Canterbury Tales. Dr. Marian Turner has studied the role of Chaucer's most famous work in establishing English. It looks like we've got some of the actual characters from the Canterbury Tales here. Do you think that's the wife of Bath? I think it must be.
That's the wife of Bath. Yeah. And over here we've got the knight.
Yeah.
We've got the miller, who's very drunk over here. And I suppose just describing those few, it immediately lets you know that this is a varied group. And that's one of the things that's particularly interesting about the Canterbury Tales. In a way, it takes the temperature of English society at this time, and it's a changing English society.
Yeah. So was it then unusual for him to be choosing English to write in?
Absolutely. By writing in the vernacular, you're signalling that you're interested in a broader audience.
Can you give me some of it? Can you do... Go on, lay some Middle English on me.
So the Canterbury Tales begins. One that April, with his sure's suit, the droct of March, hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. One that Zephyrus eke with his sweeter breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half-course run, and smaller fowls mark and melody that slape an owl the nicked with open yea, so pricketh him nature in her courages.
Oh, that sent shivers down my spine. That's amazing. So I think in the middle of that somewhere I heard you say drought, but it wasn't.
The droct of March.
Droct.
Yes. One key difference with Middle English is that you tend to pronounce all the letters. There's not so many silent letters. So say the word that we would say night would be connect, for example.
And when did it change? I mean, how did it... Presumably it happened, gradually over time.
Very gradually. Yeah. So in Chaucer's lifetime, English is creeping into more aspects of life in England. It's increasingly the language of administration. You get the development of what's called Chancery English. But then the really seismic change happens in the 1470s when Caxton sets up his printing press. One of the first books he publishes is, can you guess?
Is it possibly the Canterbury Tales?
It is
by Geoffrey Chaucer.
Yes, indeed.
Chaucer died in 1400. The same year as the last Plantagenet king. Richard II is said to have been starved to death in prison by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who took his crown. Henry IV made his coronation speech in English, his mother tongue. It was a clever bit of PR to ingratiate himself with his new subjects. The age of England's French kings had ended, and the eventful, extraordinary reign of the Plantagenets was over. 137 years later, that most English of kings, Henry VIII, would sever the crown's ties to the Pope and pillage the assets of the Church. Never again would the Church wield such political power, though Canterbury would still be an important religious centre, of course, and the Plantagenet era would remain the most dramatic episode in the history of this holiest of towns. It was the scene of a murder that launched a superstar saint who drew pilgrims from afar. A town where an ambitious archbishop built an ostentatious new palace, and where the cathedral itself was transformed into the impressive monument that still dominates the town today. There can't be any doubt. Canterbury is Britain's most Plantagenet town.